Has a single click of a folder ever changed a life forever? Arturo Pendelton was just a tired single dad, pulling a late-night IT shift, trying to keep a roof over his daughter's head. Then, he was summoned to the billionaire CEO's penthouse to fix her crashed laptop, a routine data recovery, until the screen flashed, revealing a deeply private, unmistakable photo of the most powerful woman he knew. She locked the door, looked him dead in the eye, and whispered, "Do you think I'm pretty?" The alarm on Arturo's phone buzzed at 4:30 a.m., vibrating against the cheap laminate of his nightstand. He groaned, reaching out to silence it before it could wake Lily. Arturo Pendelton was 34 years old, though the dark circles under his eyes made him look a decade older. For the past 3 years, his entire existence had been a precarious balancing act between being a father and surviving the crushing weight of medical debt. When his wife, Sarah, lost her battle with ovarian cancer, she left a void in his heart and a stack of hospital bills that drained his savings, his retirement, and his hope. All he had left was their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and a mid-level systems analyst job at Kensington Global, a massive logistics and tech conglomerate headquartered in downtown Seattle. To the executives at Kensington, Arturo was a ghost. He existed in the subterranean levels of the corporate tower, a place of humming servers, tangled Cat6 cables, and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. His job was to keep the network alive, patch the firewalls, and occasionally reset the passwords of highly paid executives who couldn't remember the name of their first pet. At the very top of that food chain was Victoria Kensington. At 32, she was the sole heir and current CEO of the empire her grandfather built. If Arturo was the ghost in the basement, Victoria was the goddess on the mountain. She was notoriously brilliant, relentlessly demanding, and entirely unapproachable. The business press called her a visionary. Her employees called her the Ice Queen. Arturo had only ever seen her from a distance, usually stepping out of a sleek black Maybach flanked by security. Her sharp features set in a permanent expression of focused intensity. It was a Tuesday evening, raining as it only does in Seattle, a persistent, bone-chilling drizzle. The office was mostly empty. Arturo was working late to earn time and a half overtime, desperately needing the extra cash to cover Lily's upcoming dental surgery. He was elbows deep in a server rack when his supervisor, David, sprinted into the room. David was sweating despite the heavy air conditioning. "Arturo, drop the patch cables. You need to get to the 65th floor, right now," David panted, his eyes wide with panic. The 65th floor, the penthouse suite. Arturo wiped grease from his hands onto his jeans. "I don't have clearance for the executive level. Dave, you do now. Victoria Kensington's personal MacBook Pro just hard crashed. She has an emergency board meeting in 3 hours, and her entire presentation, plus some heavily encrypted merger documents, is locked inside that machine. The cloud sync failed. She needs it recovered tonight." "Why me? Send one of the senior engineers." David swallowed hard. "The senior engineers are at a conference in Vegas. You're the best data recovery guy we have left in the building. Do not screw this up, Arturo, or neither of us will have a job tomorrow morning." 10 minutes later, Arturo stepped out of the private elevator onto the top floor. The difference between his basement and this level was jarring. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Seattle skyline, the city lights blurred by the relentless rain. Victoria Kensington's assistant pointed him toward massive double-oak doors. He knocked once, softly, and pushed them open. The office was the size of Arturo's entire apartment building. Behind a sprawling desk of polished mahogany stood Victoria. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than his car. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a severe twist, but a few strands had escaped. framing a face that looked unusually pale and exhausted. She was clutching a crystal glass of amber liquid and pacing like a caged leopard while barking into her phone. "I don't care what Harrison says," she snapped into the receiver, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You tell him if he moves forward with this, I will bury him. I will... Look, just buy me 24 hours. She hung up, tossing the phone onto the desk with a heavy clatter. She looked up and noticed Arturo standing awkwardly by the door, holding his canvas tool bag. "Who are you?" she demanded, her gaze sweeping over his faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots. "Arturo Pendelton, ma'am. IT department. David sent me about your laptop." She closed her eyes for a brief second, took a deep breath, and pointed to a sleek, silver machine sitting lifeless on her desk. "It went black 20 minutes ago. It won't boot. The hard drive makes a clicking sound. The files on that drive are the only things standing between me and a hostile takeover tomorrow morning. Can you fix it, Arturo?" "I can try," he said, stepping forward into her space. "Don't try," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Fix it." Arturo unpacked his gear in silence. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. He connected her laptop to his diagnostic rig, a heavy-duty, ruggedized laptop he used for brute force data extraction. "Do you mind if I connect this to your external monitor?" he asked, gesturing to the massive 32-inch ultra-wide screen on her desk. "It helps me see the directory trees more clearly when I'm running the recovery script." "Do whatever you need," Victoria said dismissively. She poured herself another measure of scotch and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out into the rainy night. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the sprawling city. Arturo booted the machine in target disk mode. Bypassing the corrupted OS, he ran a deep-level APFS volume scan. As the lines of code began scrolling down his terminal window, he realized this wasn't a standard hardware failure. "Ms. Kensington," he spoke softly, not wanting to startle her. "Your drive didn't fail from wear and tear. It looks like it was hit with a targeted malware payload, a zero-day exploit designed to corrupt the file allocation table and scramble the directory paths." She turned around, her eyes narrowing. "Someone hacked me? Someone with highly sophisticated access? Yes. Did you click on any unusual email attachments, or plug in an unverified USB drive?" "No," she said sharply. Then she hesitated. "Actually, earlier today, my ex-fiancé, Harrison, sent a courier with a flash drive. He claimed it contained the revised financial terms for our corporate merger. I plugged it in, but the drive appeared empty. I assumed it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Arturo muttered, typing furiously. "It was a logic bomb. It was set to wipe your machine hours before your board meeting. The good news is, they used a messy script. The data is still there. The computer just forgot where it put it. I'm running a deep recovery tool to pull the raw files out of the unallocated space." "How long?" 20 minutes, he promised. Victoria let out a shaky breath and walked toward the private balcony attached to her office. "I need to make a phone call, a private one. Don't touch anything else." She slid the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the freezing rain, pulling her jacket tight around her. Left alone, Arturo monitored the progress bar. 70%, 80%, 90%. He thought about Lily. If he pulled this off, maybe he could leverage it for a promotion. A bump to senior analyst would mean better health insurance. He could finally stop drowning in debt. He leaned back in the plush leather chair, watching the terminal window. 100%. Recovery complete. The software, automatically triggered a script to verify the integrity of the recovered files. To do this, it opened a visual cache on the massive 32-inch monitor, throwing up thumbnail previews of documents, spreadsheets, and media files in a rapid-fire grid. He watched the screen to ensure the PDFs were rendering correctly. Then, right in the center of the ultra-wide monitor, a high-resolution image rendered. It didn't pop up as a tiny thumbnail. The software previewed it at full size. Arturo's blood ran cold. His hand froze over the mouse. It was Victoria. She was in a dimly lit, luxurious hotel room. But she wasn't wearing her bespoke charcoal suit. She wasn't wearing anything at all. It wasn't a glamorous, posed boudoir shot. It was raw, intimate, and deeply vulnerable. She was sitting on the edge of a bed, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, looking up at the camera with an expression that shattered the Ice Queen facade completely. There was fear in her eyes. It was a photo taken by someone she trusted, in a moment where that trust was actively being broken. It was a photograph that could destroy a CEO. It could tank a stock price, ruin a reputation, and end a career overnight. And it was blazing across a massive screen in brilliant, undeniable high definition. His brain screamed to move his hand, to grab the mouse, to click the X in the corner of the window. But the shock paralyzed him for 2 fatal seconds. Behind him, Arturo heard the heavy thud of the balcony door sliding shut. He snapped out of his trance and violently jerked the mouse, slamming the cursor into the corner and closing the window. But it was too late. The reflection of the monitor had cast a bright, pale light across the dark room. He slowly turned the heavy leather chair around. Victoria Kensington was standing 5 feet away. She was dripping wet from the rain, her mascara slightly smudged. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the blank screen, knowing exactly what had just been displayed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Arturo couldn't breathe. He was a dead man. He was going to be fired, sued, and probably thrown in a dark hole by corporate lawyers. She didn't scream. She didn't call security. Instead, she walked slowly over to the mahogany doors leading out to the hallway. With a loud, echoing click, she turned the deadbolt, locking them inside. She turned back to him, walked around the desk, and leaned against the edge of it. She crossed her arms, mirroring the exact defensive posture she had held in that terrible photograph. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes locked onto his. "Do you think I'm pretty, Arturo?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't seductive. It was trembling, laced with an agonizing, desperate sorrow. Arturo swallowed hard, his mouth tasting like copper. This was a trap. It had to be a trap. HR nightmares flashed before his eyes. "Ms. Kensington," he stammered, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I swear to God, I didn't go looking for that. The recovery software automatically previews media files to check for data corruption. It popped up. I closed it. I haven't seen it. I don't remember it. And I will sign whatever NDA your lawyers put in front of me tonight." She didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on him, piercing and unblinking. "You didn't answer my question, Arturo." He looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the veneer of the untouchable billionaire, he saw a woman pushed to the absolute edge of a cliff. He saw the same desperate exhaustion he felt when he looked in the mirror at 3 a.m. after comforting a crying child. "Yes," he said quietly, abandoning the corporate script. "You are incredibly beautiful. But you also looked terrified, like someone was backing you into a corner." Victoria's breath hitched. For a second, the titanium armor cracked. A single tear escaped her eye, tracking down her cheek before she aggressively wiped it away. She walked over to her liquor cabinet, abandoning the scotch in favor of pouring 2 fingers of neat vodka. She downed it in one fluid motion. "His name is Harrison Miller," she said, her voice hardening again as she stared at the empty glass. "We were engaged. 3 months ago, I found out he was funneling Kensington Global's proprietary algorithms to a rival firm he secretly owned. I broke off the engagement and quietly kicked him off the board to avoid a public scandal." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "He didn't take it well. During a trip to Paris last year, he took that photo. I told him no. I begged him to delete it. He told me he did. But Harrison never throws away leverage." Arturo slowly stood up from the desk. "The flash drive he sent today. It wasn't just to wipe your computer for the board meeting. No," she said bitterly. "It was a message. He wiped my machine to prove he could touch me, anywhere, anytime, and to let me know that if I don't sign over 51% of Kensington Global to his holding company tomorrow morning, that photo goes to the Wall Street Journal, every tech blog, and every major shareholder. Can't you go to the police? It's revenge porn. It's extortion. It's highly illegal. And what happens the moment I file a police report? Arturo," she snapped. "It becomes public record. The photo leaks anyway as evidence. The conservative board members of this company will use the scandal to invoke the morality clause in my contract. I'll be ousted. Harrison swoops in, buys the tanking stock for pennies on the dollar, and dismantles my grandfather's company." She walked toward him, stopping just inches away. He could smell her perfume, Tom Ford Black Orchid, mixed with the scent of the Seattle rain. "If Harrison takes over, his first move is structural efficiency," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. "He's going to liquidate the Seattle headquarters. 4,000 jobs, Arturo, including yours. The severance packages will be tied up in litigation for years." Arturo's stomach plummeted. He thought of the stack of past due notices sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought of Lily's surgery. If he lost his job, if he lost his health insurance, they were ruined. They would be on the street. "Why are you telling me all of this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm just a systems analyst. I fix routers." "Because you're invisible," Victoria said, her eyes searching his. "And because you just bypassed Harrison's military-grade logic bomb in 20 minutes flat. You are much more than a router technician. Arturo Pendelton, I read your file while you were working. MIT dropout, arrested a decade ago for unauthorized penetration testing on a federal banking server. Charges dropped quietly." He stiffened. "That was a long time ago. I was a stupid kid. I play by the rules now. I have a daughter to protect. And, right now, playing by the rules is going to put your daughter out on the street." She countered flawlessly, hitting the exact nerve she knew would paralyze him. "I need someone who isn't on Harrison's radar. My personal security team is compromised. Corporate IT is compromised. You are a ghost. You don't exist to him." "What do you want me to do?" Victoria pulled a black encrypted flash drive from her pocket and set it on the desk. "I want you to hack into Harrison Miller's private servers. I want you to find the master copy of that photograph, every backup, every cloud sync, and I want you to burn it all to the ground. Then, I want you to find the financial records proving he stole our algorithms." "You're asking me to commit multiple federal crimes," he said, taking a step back. "If I get caught, I go to federal prison. Lily goes into the foster system. I can't. I'm sorry. Ms. Kensington, I just can't." He turned toward his tool bag and started packing up his cables. His hands were shaking. $500,000. she said into the silence of the room. His hands stopped moving. Tax-free, wired to an offshore trust in your daughter's name the moment the files are secured, Victoria continued, her tone entirely businesslike now. Your medical debts are paid. Her college is paid. You will never have to work a night shift in a damp basement ever again. He stood, frozen. $500,000. It was an astronomical sum. It was freedom. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning man's desperate ocean. He turned back to look at her. She was standing in the shadows of the dimly lit office, a billionaire queen offering a desperate peasant a deal with the devil. Harrison's servers will be air-gapped, Arturo said slowly, the technical part of his brain already working through the impossible logistics. He's a paranoid venture capitalist. We can't do it remotely. I would need physical access to his local network. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tomorrow night, Harrison is hosting a private gala at his estate on Mercer Island to celebrate the upcoming merger. I am mandated to attend to keep up appearances. You are going to be my +1. The next morning, Arturo woke up on the lumpy sofa in his apartment. A thin fleece blanket tangled around his legs. The smell of burnt toast drifted from the tiny kitchen. "Daddy, you're going to be late," Lily's voice chimed. She was standing at the edge of the living room, wearing a mismatched outfit, a pink tutu over striped pajama pants, and holding a plate with a charred piece of bread. Her bright blue eyes, so much like her mother's, looked at him with innocent urgency. He sat up, his joints popping, the memory of the previous night crashing over him like a wave of ice water. Victoria Kensington, the photograph, $500,000. "I'm not going to the office today. Bug," he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and pulling her into a tight hug. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and maple syrup. "Daddy has a special project for the boss. Mrs. Higgins is going to pick you up from school today and stay late. Okay." Lily frowned, her little brow furrowing. "But you promised we could build the Lego castle tonight." Guilt twisted like a knife in his gut. "I know, sweetheart, I promise. After this project is done, we're going to build the biggest castle ever. We might even be able to get that big set you saw in the window at the mall." Her eyes widened. "The one with the dragon. The one with the dragon," he confirmed, kissing the top of her head. By noon, his life had completely decoupled from reality. Victoria hadn't just given him an assignment. She had orchestrated a complete takeover of his day. A sleek black town car arrived at his apartment building, drawing stares from his neighbors. The driver handed him a heavy, embossed envelope containing a single platinum credit card and an address in downtown Seattle. The address belonged to a bespoke tailor named Francois. When Arturo walked in, wearing his usual jeans and faded jacket, Francois didn't blink. "Mr. Pendelton, Ms. Kensington called ahead. We have 3 hours to perform a miracle." By 5 p.m., he didn't recognize the man staring back at him in the three-way mirror. The charcoal, worsted wool suit fit with lethal precision. His messy hair had been professionally trimmed and styled. He looked sharp. He looked dangerous. He looked exactly like the kind of high-priced corporate mercenary who belonged on the arm of a billionaire CEO. "You clean up well, Arturo," a voice said. He turned. Victoria Kensington was standing in the doorway of the fitting room. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that caught the ambient light like a cut jewel. Her hair swept up in an elegant, complex knot. She looked breathtaking, but her eyes were cold, scanning him for flaws like a diamond merchant inspecting a stone. "You look the part," she decided, stepping into the room and handing him a sleek, matte black smartphone. "This is a clean device, encrypted. The flash drive I gave you last night is loaded with a custom Python script. Once you plug it into Harrison's master terminal, it will map the directory, locate the image hash, and shred the files. It overwrites the sectors 35 times. Not even the NSA could recover it. "And the financial files?" he asked, slipping the drive into the inner pocket of his jacket. "Download them to the phone. Once we have the proof of his embezzlement, the leverage shifts. I crush him at the board meeting tomorrow." She reached out and adjusted the lapel of his suit, her fingers brushing lightly against his chest. Her touch was surprisingly warm. Harrison's estate is on Mercer Island. He's hosting 200 of the wealthiest tech investors in the Pacific Northwest. There will be private security everywhere. If you get caught, Arturo, I don't know you. You are a rogue contractor. Do you understand? "I understand," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "$500,000 for my daughter. I won't fail." "Good." She stepped back. "Tonight, your name is Arturo Pendelton, independent cybersecurity auditor for the Kensington board. Act like you own the room. Rich people only respect arrogance." An hour later, they were on a private, Chris-Craft speedboat, cutting across the dark, choppy waters of Lake Washington. The rain had cleared, leaving a crisp, starry night. Looming ahead of them was Mercer Island, and perched on its eastern shore was a sprawling, modern glass and steel mansion, blazing with light. Harrison Miller's fortress. Arturo touched the small earpiece hidden in his right ear, ensuring it was synced to Victoria's phone. They stepped off the boat onto a private mahogany dock. The moment her heels hit the wood, Victoria's posture shifted. The vulnerable woman from the office vanished, replaced entirely by the Ice Queen. "Showtime," she murmured, slipping her arm through his. The interior of Harrison's estate was a monument to tech boom excess. Vaulted ceilings, floating staircases, and a massive infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the lake. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and beluga caviar. The room was a sea of designer dresses and custom tuxedos. The moment Victoria entered the grand foyer, the ambient noise of the party dropped half a decibel. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew about the impending Kensington-Miller merger. What they didn't know was the bloodbath happening behind closed doors. They hadn't been inside for 5 minutes before the crowd parted. And Harrison Miller materialized. He was strikingly handsome in a predatory, polished way, tall, with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his pale, calculating eyes. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket. "Victoria, darling," Harrison said, his voice smooth and carrying just enough volume for the nearby guests to hear. He reached out to kiss her cheek, but she smoothly turned her head, forcing his lips to meet the cold air near her ear. "Harrison," she replied, her tone perfectly pleasant and entirely hollow. "Beautiful party. I see you're still overcompensating with the ice sculptures." Harrison chuckled, his eyes flicking toward Arturo. The amusement vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, assessing glare. "And who is this? I don't believe you were on the guest list, friend." This is Arturo Pendelton," Victoria said seamlessly. "He's an independent risk assessment auditor. The board insisted I bring him to evaluate the structural integrity of our newly proposed joint network architecture." Harrison's smile tightened into a grimace. "Is that so? Well, Mr. Pendleton, you'll find my architecture is impenetrable. In my experience, Mr. Miller," Arturo said, holding his gaze with a dead-eyed stare he usually reserved for aggressive debt collectors. "There is no such thing as an impenetrable system. It just depends on how hard you're willing to hit the firewall." Harrison laughed, but it sounded like glass breaking. I like him. Victoria, he's got bite. Enjoy the champagne, Mr. Pendleton. Just don't wander too far. The estate is a maze, and some doors are strictly off limits. He gave Victoria one last, lingering look. A look laced with such venomous, triumphant ownership that it made Arturo's blood boil, and turned back to his guests. He's keeping the servers in his private sub-basement, Victoria whispered, barely moving her lips as she took a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. I've been here before. Take the east corridor past the kitchens. There's a biometric door leading down. I'll keep his attention out here. I can't bypass a biometric scanner with a Python script. Victoria, Arturo whispered back. It reads, fingerprints. I know, she said, reaching into her emerald clutch. She palmed a small, silicone patch no larger than a postage stamp and pressed it smoothly into his hand. I pulled his prints off a wine glass months ago when I first suspected he was stealing from me. I had this molded in Zurich. It's conductive. Press it over your thumb. Arturo stared at her, genuinely shocked. You've been planning to rob him for months. I don't survive in this industry by playing defense. Arturo, go. Arturo slipped the silicone patch into his pocket and seamlessly detached himself from her side, blending into the flow of the catering staff. He moved with purpose, projecting the aura of a man who belonged exactly where he was walking. He bypassed the crowded living spaces and pushed through the swinging doors into the massive, industrial-grade catering kitchen. A chef yelled something at him in French, but he ignored him, stepping out the back exit into a quiet, carpeted hallway. At the end of the corridor was a heavy steel door, entirely out of place in the sleek, modern mansion. Next to it was a glowing green thumbprint scanner. Arturo checked over his shoulder. The hallway was empty, save for a security camera perched in the corner. He had 30 seconds before the monitoring guard noticed he was lingering. He fished the silicone patch out of his pocket, smoothed it over his right thumb, and pressed it firmly against the glass reader. The scanner pulsed blue, then red. Access denied. Sweat prickled at the back of Arturo's neck. He adjusted the patch, pressing harder to ensure the conductive material made full contact, mimicking the heat and electrical resistance of human skin. Pulse, blue. Pulse, red. Access denied. Damn it, he hissed under his breath. He looked up at the camera. The red recording light was blinking. Someone was definitely watching now. He pressed the earpiece. Victoria, the print isn't working. It's rejecting the capacitive signature. Try again. Her voice crackled in his ear, strained over the sound of a string quartet in the background. It has to work. It's not working. And I'm on camera. I need a distraction, right now, or this whole thing is blown. There was a 3-second pause. Then, over the earpiece, Arturo heard the sound of shattering glass, followed by a chorus of gasps from the ballroom. Oh my God! I am so incredibly sorry! Victoria's voice rang out, loud and theatrical. Harrison, your beautiful vintage clock. I just bumped it. I think I'm bleeding. Can someone get security? I need a first aid kit immediately. In the hallway, the radio on a nearby security guard's belt crackled to life. All units to the main foyer. We have a medical incident with a VIP guest. The camera above him suddenly whirred, panning away toward the main hallway to track the guard running toward the commotion. Arturo had one last shot. He breathed on the silicone patch to give it moisture, rubbed it vigorously on his wool trousers to build up static friction, and slammed his thumb onto the glass. Pulse blue, pulse green, click. The heavy steel magnets released. He pushed the door open and slipped into the darkness of the stairwell, the door locking heavily behind him. The sub-basement was freezing. The ambient temperature was kept at a steady 60 degrees to prevent the massive server racks from overheating. The noise was a deafening, constant roar of cooling fans. The room was bathed in the blue LED glow of a dozen high-end server blades. In the center of the room sat a standalone terminal, a brushed aluminum console completely detached from the main network racks, air-gapped. This was Harrison's vault. No internet connection, no Bluetooth, no Wi-Fi. The only way in or out was a physical data port. Arturo sat down at the terminal and woke the screen. It immediately prompted for a password. Harrison wasn't stupid. He was using a localized 256-bit AES encryption. Brute forcing the password would take a supercomputer 3,000 years. Fortunately, he didn't need the password. He just needed to bypass the operating system. He pulled the black flash drive from his pocket and jammed it into the USB port. He rebooted the terminal, hammering the F12 key to force the machine into the BIOS menu. From there, he bypassed his localized hard drive and booted directly from the partition on his flash drive. The screen went black, then filled with the cascading green text of Victoria's custom Python script, initiating root-level directory mapping. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He wasn't just a ghost, he was an apex predator in his own element. He bypassed the user interface restrictions and opened a raw command line window, viewing the entire contents of Harrison's hard drive as a massive tree of text. "I'm in," he whispered into the earpiece. "Find it," Victoria replied, her voice breathless. "Find the photo, Arturo. Burn it." He ran a search query looking for hidden media files and specific metadata tags matching the date of their Paris trip. Query complete. One match found. Directory. C. Ja system. Config sys32. Nullo 1. Archive JWVK. Insurance. JPEG. He had buried it deep within fake system folders. Arturo highlighted the file path. All he had to do was hit Enter to execute the 35-pass overwrite. But his eyes caught something else. Right next to VK Insurance, JPEG was a massive compressed folder titled Project Icarus Truth, ZIP. He frowned, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off his glasses. "Victoria, I found the photo, but I found something else. A massive data cache labeled Project Icarus Truth." Over the earpiece, the background noise of the party seemed to vanish. He could hear Victoria's sharp intake of breath. "Don't touch it," she commanded, her voice suddenly trembling, losing all its icy composure. "Delete the photo and get out of there, Arturo, now." "Victoria, this folder is huge. It has schematics, internal emails between your board members, and government regulatory sign-offs. What is Project Icarus?" "It's Kensington Global's new autonomous logistics drone system," she snapped. "It goes live next month. It's what the merger is built on." "I said don't touch it." He quickly typed a command to view the file headers inside the zip folder. His blood ran cold as he read the subject lines of the stolen emails. Subject: Fatal error in navigation array. Cover-up required. Subject: Civilian casualty projections do not distribute. Subject: RIP bribing. FAA inspectors. Wire transfers confirmed. Harrison wasn't just blackmailing Victoria with a nude photo to force a merger. He was using the photo as a distraction. He had stolen the internal proof that Kensington Global's flagship technology was dangerously defective, and that Victoria's board of directors had bribed federal agents to cover it up. If this merger happened, Harrison would own the technology, fix the flaw, and hold the Kensington board hostage forever. But if these drones launched next month as planned, people were going to die. "You lied to me," he whispered into the mic, staring at the screen in horror. The board is pushing this merger to cover up a lethal defect, and Harrison is going to use this folder to control them. Arturo, listen to me, Victoria pleaded. I didn't know about the defect until last week. The board went behind my back. If that folder leaks, the company is destroyed. Thousands of people go to prison, including me. Just delete the photo. I will wire you $1 million. 2 million, please. Arturo looked at the blinking cursor. On one hand, the woman who hired him, the woman whose deeply private, violating photograph was sitting right here, ready to be destroyed. On the other hand, a corporate conspiracy that would put civilian lives at risk just to boost a stock price. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the server room groaned behind him. The magnetic lock clanked loudly. "Hey!" A gruff voice echoed through the freezing room. Arturo whipped his head around. A massive security guard in a black suit was standing in the doorway, his hand reaching for the taser on his belt. "Step away from the terminal. Hands where I can see them." Panic spiked in his chest. He had 3 seconds. He couldn't just execute the deletion script for the photo. It took 60 seconds to overwrite the sectors, and he didn't have the time. Instead, he rapidly typed a different command. He highlighted both VK Insurance JPEG and Project Icarus Truth zip. He hit the command to copy both files directly to his encrypted smartphone via the USB tether. Then, he slammed his fist onto the physical format drive button on the brute force script, wiping Harrison's entire master drive, and yanked the cables out. "I said hands up!" The guard roared, charging down the narrow aisle of server racks. Arturo grabbed his phone, shoved it into his jacket, and grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher off the wall. As the guard lunged around the corner, Arturo hurled the red canister directly at his legs. It connected with a sickening crack. The guard shouted in pain, tumbling hard onto the metal floor grating, his taser skittering away into the darkness. Arturo didn't wait to see if he was getting up. He bolted over him, sprinting through the steel doors and out into the corridor. "Victoria!" He panted into the earpiece, his heart pounding in his ears as he sprinted toward the kitchen exit. "Harrison's drive is wiped. I have the files, all of them, but I'm burned. Security is coming." "Get to the dock!" she shouted over the earpiece. "I'm already on the boat. Run, Arturo!" He burst through the kitchen doors, startling the catering staff, and sprinted across the expansive back lawn, the cold Seattle air burning his lungs. Sirens were beginning to wail from the front of the estate. The Chris Craft speedboat was idling at the dock. Victoria standing at the helm, the engine roaring. Arturo leapt from the wood, clearing the water, and crashed hard onto the leather seats in the back of the boat. Victoria slammed the throttle forward. The boat surged into the dark waters of Lake Washington, leaving the chaos of the Mercer Island mansion behind them. He lay on the deck, staring up at the stars, his chest heaving. In his jacket pocket, the phone felt like a brick of radioactive material. He now held the only existing copy of a photo that could destroy a billionaire CEO, and the corporate espionage documents that could send her entire board of directors to federal prison. The invisible IT guy was now the most powerful man in Seattle, and he had no idea what to do next. The Chris Craft tore across the black expanse of Lake Washington, the bow slamming violently against the chop of the water. The freezing wind whipped Arturo's hair and stung his eyes, but the adrenaline surging through his veins made the cold irrelevant. He was clutching the gunwale with one hand, his other pressed firmly against his chest pocket, where the encrypted smartphone sat like a ticking time bomb. Victoria stood at the helm, the emerald green fabric of her gown snapping furiously in the wind. She pushed the throttle down hard, the engine screaming as they put a mile between them and Harrison Miller's estate. Only when the glittering lights of Mercer Island receded into a blur did she finally pull back on the throttle. The boat slowed, settling into the dark, rolling swells. They were drifting in the middle of the lake, surrounded by total darkness, the Seattle skyline glowing faintly in the distance. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sloshing of water against the fiberglass hull. Victoria turned off the ignition, plunging them into an eerie quiet. She turned around to face him. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was evaporating, replaced by a desperate, frantic hunger. "Give me the phone, Arturo," she commanded, holding out her hand. Her voice was steady, but he could see the slight tremor in her fingers. Arturo sat up slowly, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the sleek black device, but he didn't hand it over. He kept it tightly gripped in his palm. "The photo is on here," he said, his voice hoarse. "I copied it directly from his hidden directory, and then I formatted his master drive. Harrison has nothing, no backups, no cloud syncs. The script shredded everything 35 times over. The leverage he had on you is gone." A wave of profound relief washed over Victoria's face. For a fraction of a second, the billionaire CEO vanished entirely, leaving behind a woman who had just been released from death row. She closed her eyes, exhaling a breath that seemed to carry months of terror. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping toward him. "You have no idea what you've just done for me. The wire transfer will be in your daughter's offshore trust by tomorrow morning. $500,000, just like we agreed. Now, please, give me the phone so I can destroy it." He took a step back, retreating toward the stern of the boat. "I can't do that, Victoria." Her eyes snapped open, the relief vanishing, replaced instantly by the icy, calculating glare of the executive. "Excuse me? If this is a negotiation for more money, Arturo, name your price. $1 million, $2 million. Don't play games with me." "This isn't about money," he said, his grip on the phone tightening. "I didn't just copy the photograph, Victoria. I copied a folder called Project Icarus Truth. I read the internal emails. I saw the schematics." The blood drained from Victoria's face. She stood perfectly still, looking at him as if he had just morphed into a ghost. "You promised me you wouldn't touch it," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, serrated whisper. "I promised I would help a woman who was being sexually blackmailed." He fired back, the anger finally bubbling over. "I didn't promise to help cover up a corporate conspiracy. Your board of directors bribed FAA officials to approve an autonomous drone system that has a fatal navigation flaw. The internal projections literally calculate civilian casualties. If I give you this phone, you bury these files. The merger goes through, and next month, drones start dropping out of the sky onto residential neighborhoods. I won't be an accomplice to murder." "You don't understand how these people work!" Victoria shouted, her composure shattering. She stepped aggressively into his space, pointing a trembling finger at his chest. "I didn't know about the defect, Arturo. Richard Caldwell and the rest of the board kept it from me. By the time I found out, the bribes were paid, the FAA sign-offs were public, and the production lines were rolling. If those files leak, the SEC and the FBI will dismantle Kensington Global. 4,000 innocent employees will lose everything. And if they don't leak, innocent people die. It's corporate collateral. Arturo, it's the cost of doing business at this level." The words tore out of her throat, desperate and ugly, and the moment she said them, she stopped, looking horrified by her own voice. They stared at each other in the dim light of the boat's navigation instruments. He saw the tragic reality of Victoria Kensington. She wasn't an evil woman. but she had been entirely consumed by the machine her grandfather built. She was willing to compromise her own soul just to keep the engines running. "I'm not playing God, Victoria," he said quietly, the rage fading into a cold, hard resolve. "But I have a 6-year-old daughter. I have to look her in the eyes and tell her to do the right thing when it's hard. I can't do that if I walk away with blood money." "If you release those files," Victoria warned, her voice hollow, "Harrison will spin the narrative. He'll make sure I take the fall. I'll go to federal prison, and Harrison's men will hunt you down. You are a single dad from the basement IT department. You cannot fight billionaires." "I guess we'll find out," Arturo said. "Start the engine. Drop me off at the Kirkland Public Marina. And if I refuse, then I throw this phone into the lake," he said, holding the device out over the dark, churning water. "The photo of you is gone forever. Yes, but Harrison's master drive is wiped. He won't have the leverage to force the merger tomorrow, but you won't have the proof to expose him or the board. It'll be a stalemate, and they will eventually replace you anyway." Victoria glared at him, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind. Without a word, she turned back to the console, turned the key, and slammed the throttle forward. They rode in absolute silence toward the eastern shore. When the boat bumped against the wooden pylons of the Kirkland public dock, Arturo stepped off without looking back. "Arturo," she called out, her voice cutting through the dark. He stopped on the wet wooden planks. "They won't just come for you," she said, her tone devoid of threats, leaving only a chilling fact. "Harrison will go for your leverage. He will go for Lily." His blood ran cold. He turned and sprinted down the dock, disappearing into the shadows of the city. It was 11:30 p.m. The rain had returned to Seattle, falling in relentless sheets that soaked through Arturo's bespoke suit. He had tossed the encrypted phone into a Faraday bag he carried in his pocket to block the GPS signal, but he knew Harrison's security team would be mobilizing. He didn't go home. Going back to his apartment was suicide. Instead, he sprinted 4 blocks to a 24-hour convenience store, bought a burner phone with cash, and called Mrs. Higgins. "Arturo, dear, do you know what time it is?" The elderly woman's groggy voice answered. "Mrs. Higgins, I am so sorry. Is Lily asleep?" "Sound asleep on the sofa. We watched a movie." "What's wrong? Your voice sounds terrible." "There's been a security breach at my office. It's a domestic issue with a disgruntled former employee. They're telling everyone to secure their families. I'm coming to get her right now. Do not open the door for anyone but me. Lock the deadbolts." He hung up before she could ask questions, hailed a passing cab, and threw a $100 bill at the driver. "Queen Anne Hill, step on it." They arrived at Mrs. Higgins' quiet suburban street 20 minutes later. He told the cab to park 2 blocks away and keep the engine running. Arturo moved through the shadows of the wet oak trees, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he approached her quaint single-story house, his stomach bottomed out. Parked silently at the end of the cul-de-sac was a matte black Lincoln Navigator. The engine was off, but he could see the faint glow of a dashboard screen illuminating the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. Another man, in a dark raincoat, was casually walking up the sidewalk toward Mrs. Higgins's front porch. They had tracked his employee records. Harrison wasn't waiting for the morning. Arturo moved purely on instinct. He sprinted across the wet grass, flanking the man in the raincoat, just as he reached the top step of the porch. He didn't announce himself. He simply tackled him from the side, driving his shoulder directly into the man's ribs. They crashed off the porch and into the azalea bushes in a tangle of limbs. The guard was trained, instantly throwing an elbow that caught Arturo hard in the jaw, leaving the taste of copper in his mouth. But Arturo was fighting for his daughter. He grabbed a fistful of the raincoat, slammed the man's head against the brick foundation of the house, and ripped the heavy tactical radio off his belt before he could key the mic. The guard slumped into the mud, unconscious. Arturo scrambled up the porch steps and pounded frantically on the door. Knock, knock, pause, knock. The code he used with Lily. The door unbolted, and Mrs. Higgins peered out, terrified. He pushed past her, scooped up a sleeping Lily from the sofa, wrapping her tightly in her fleece blanket. Arturo, what is happening? Don't turn on the lights, he hissed, handing Mrs. Higgins the unconscious guard's radio. Call 911. Tell them an armed prowler is in your yard. Lock this door and hide in the bathroom. Without waiting for a response, he carried Lily out the back door, running through the muddy alleyways, hopping low fences until his lungs burned. They burst onto the main avenue, found the waiting cab, and piled in. Where to, buddy? The driver asked, eyeing Arturo's muddy, torn suit in the rearview mirror. SeaTac Airport area. Find me the cheapest motel that takes cash. By 2:00 a.m., Lily was safely asleep on the sagging bed of a run-down roadside motel. Clutching a plastic remote control, Arturo had wiped clean with a towel. The neon sign outside flickered red, casting long shadows across the stained carpet. He sat at the rickety laminate desk, his ruggedized laptop booted up, the encrypted smartphone tethered via USB. It was time to stop running. It was time to go to war. Arturo was an IT guy. He spent his life building architectures and firewalls. Now he was going to tear one down. First, he built a dead man's switch. He coded a script that tethered to his heartbeat via his smart watch. If his heart rate flatlined, or if he didn't enter a randomly generated 32-character encryption key every 60 minutes, an automated protocol would execute. It would instantly blast the entire Project Icarus truth cache to the tip lines of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice. He was officially untouchable. If Harrison killed him or arrested him, he destroyed himself. Next, Arturo tackled the photograph. VK or Insurance, JPEG. He stared at the file name on the screen. It would be so easy to use this, to hold it over Victoria, to force her to pay him, to ensure his safety. But looking at Lily sleeping peacefully on the bed, he knew he couldn't do it. He refused to let his daughter's future be funded by the sexual humiliation of another woman. He pulled a blank micro SD card from his bag. He transferred the photo directly onto the physical card. Then, using a military-grade digital shredder, he wiped the photo entirely from the phone, his laptop, and all temporary caches. The only copy of Victoria Kensington's darkest secret now rested on a piece of plastic the size of his fingernail. Arturo spent the next 4 hours writing emails, compiling the evidence of the drone defect, highlighting the bribes paid by Richard Caldwell and the board, and neatly packaging Harrison Miller's illegal surveillance logs. He set the email server on a delayed trigger. At 6:30 a.m., the sun began to rise, bleeding gray light through the cheap motel curtains. He washed his face in the rust-stained sink. His jaw was swollen and bruised from the fight, his bespoke suit stained with mud and blood. He looked like a man who had gone through hell. "Daddy," a sleepy voice mumbled from the bed. He walked over, sitting on the edge of the mattress, and stroked Lily's hair. "Hey, Bug, did you sleep okay?" "Where are we?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "We're on a secret mission. We're hiding out like spies. In a few hours, Mrs. Higgins is going to come pick you up, and you guys are going to go get ice cream. But Daddy has to go to work first. I have to finish the project. Will you be home tonight for the Lego castle? Arturo swallowed the lump in his throat. He was about to walk into a room full of the most powerful, ruthless people in the city and threaten to burn their empire to the ground. There was a very real chance he was going to federal prison today. I promise, Lily, I will move heaven and earth to be there tonight. At 8:45 a.m., Arturo walked through the revolving glass doors of Kensington Global headquarters. He didn't sneak in through the loading dock. He didn't swipe his badge at the basement service elevator. He walked right up to the executive elevator bank, wearing the ruined, mud-stained charcoal suit, his face bruised and his eyes devoid of fear. "Hey, sir, you can't be Arturo?" The lobby security chief, a guy named Stan who he usually played fantasy football with, stepped in front of him, looking bewildered. "Morning, Stan," Arturo said calmly. "I need to go to the 65th floor. Arturo, you look like you got hit by a bus, and you're restricted from the executive levels. Come with me. Let's go down to medical." Arturo reached into his pocket, pulled out the micro SD card, and held it up. "Stan, if I don't walk into that boardroom in exactly 3 minutes, Victoria Kensington is going to lose this company. Step aside." Stan hesitated, looking at Arturo's bruised face, then stepped back, swiping his master access card on the elevator reader. "If I lose my pension for this, Pendleton, I'm haunting you." The doors slid shut. The elevator shot upward, his stomach dropping as the floor numbers ticked higher. 60, 62, 64, 65. Ding. He stepped out onto the plush carpet of the penthouse level. The receptionist gasped, dropping her phone as he marched past her desk. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were closed. 2 massive men in dark suits, Harrison's private security, stood blocking the entrance. Arturo recognized one of them. He was the driver from the SUV outside Mrs. Higgins' house. The man moved to grab him, reaching inside his jacket. "I have a dead man's switch tied to my vitals. Sending the Icarus files to the FBI if my heart stops," Arturo said, not breaking stride. "Touch me, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a supermax prison for corporate espionage." The guard froze, his hand hovering over his holster. Arturo shoved his way between them and kicked the heavy mahogany doors open. The boardroom was magnificent, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle harbor. Around a massive 20-foot conference table sat the Kensington Board of Directors. At the head of the table sat Richard Caldwell, the silver-haired, arrogant chairman. To his right sat Harrison Miller, wearing a pristine gray suit, a smug smile plastered across his face. To his left sat Victoria Kensington. She looked entirely defeated, staring blankly at a thick stack of merger documents sitting in front of her. A gold Mont Blanc pen clutched tightly in her hand. When the doors slammed against the walls, all heads snapped toward Arturo. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Richard Caldwell barked, standing up. "Security! Remove this lunatic!" Harrison Miller's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, venomous shock. "You!" he hissed. "You're supposed to be dead, or at least in custody. Turns out your goons are as incompetent as your cybersecurity. Harrison," Arturo said loudly, walking straight toward the head of the table. "Arturo," Victoria whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Security!" Caldwell yelled again. The 2 guards stepped into the doorway, but hesitated, looking at Harrison for orders. "Let him speak," Harrison said smoothly, regaining his composure. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "He's bluffing, whatever you think you have. Mr. Pendleton, it's useless. You're a low-level IT tech who broke into my home. I've already filed police reports. You have no proof of anything." "Really?" Arturo reached into his pocket, pulled out the burner phone, and tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. It slid to a stop right in front of Harrison. "Call your system admin. Ask him about the master drive in your sub-basement. Ask him how many passes it took me to shred every piece of data you've hoarded for the last 5 years." Harrison's eyes narrowed. He snatched the phone, dialed a number, and put it to his ear. The silence in the room was absolute. They watched his face as he listened to the panicked voice on the other end. The color slowly drained from his perfectly tanned cheeks. He hung up, slamming the phone onto the table. "You son of a bitch. The merger is dead," Arturo declared, turning to Richard Caldwell and the rest of the board. "Because the leverage Mr. Miller was using to force this acquisition no longer exists," Caldwell scoffed, though he looked nervously at Harrison. "We are voting on this merger because it's good for the shareholders, not because of leverage. Ms. Kensington was just about to sign the transfer of equity." Arturo walked over to Victoria. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, entirely unsure if he was there to save her or destroy her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny micro SD card. He placed it gently on the documents in front of her. "That is the only existing copy," he said softly, meant only for her ears. "No backups, no clouds. It's yours completely." Victoria stared at the tiny piece of plastic. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her posture instantly straightening. The Ice Queen was returning, but this time, her armor wasn't made of fear. It was made of vindication. She picked up the SD card, slipped it into her pocket, and then picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen. With a swift, aggressive motion, she struck a massive X through the signature line of the merger documents. "The deal is off. Harrison," Victoria said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Get out of my building." "You arrogant fool," Harrison sneered, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "You think you've won because your lapdog deleted some files. I still have the backing of the board. Caldwell has the votes to oust you by noon. You'll be removed as CEO by the end of the day." "I don't think he will," Arturo interrupted. He pulled his ruggedized laptop out of his canvas bag and slammed it onto the conference table, flipping the screen open. "Richard Caldwell," he said, reading from the screen. "Chairman of the board. Last month, you authorized a wire transfer of $2.4 million from a Kensington shell company to an offshore account owned by a senior inspector at the Federal Aviation Administration. In exchange, he signed off on the safety regulations for Project Icarus, despite your own internal engineers explicitly warning you that the navigation array fails 14% of the time in high-density urban environments. The entire boardroom erupted in panicked whispers. Caldwell turned ghost white, stumbling backward and collapsing into his chair. That is fabricated," Caldwell stammered, sweating profusely. "That is corporate espionage. You have no proof." "I have the internal emails," Arturo said, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I have the FAA safety failure reports that you suppressed. I have the bank routing numbers, and I have Harrison Miller's extortion letters, proving he stole the data to force this merger." Arturo looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 9 a.m. "10 minutes ago," he continued, the room falling dead silent again. "A coded script sent the entire 500-gigabyte cache of the Icarus truth files to the regional director of the SEC, the investigative desk at the New York Times, and the local field office of the FBI. You aren't voting on a merger today. Gentlemen, you're voting on who is going to rat out the others first to secure a plea deal. Right on cue. The muffled, unmistakable wail of police sirens drifted up from the streets of downtown Seattle. The sound filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass, sealing their fate. Panic consumed the room. Two board members immediately grabbed their briefcases and ran for the door. Caldwell put his head in his hands, realizing his life was over. Harrison Miller looked at Arturo with a hatred so pure, it practically burned. But he didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked out, his private security flanked around him, preparing for the legal bloodbath that was about to consume his life. Arturo closed his laptop, the adrenaline finally leaving his system, replaced by an exhaustion so deep, his bones ached. The boardroom was empty, save for him and Victoria. She stood up from the table, looking out the window at the flashing red and blue lights pulling up to the plaza 65 stories below. "You destroyed my grandfather's company, Arturo," she said quietly. "I saved it," he corrected her. "The stock is going to tank today. Caldwell is going to prison. The Icarus project will be grounded. But Kensington Global isn't built on a foundation of blood anymore. You have the chance to rebuild it the right way. Your way." She turned to look at him, a genuine, unguarded smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time since they had met. "I offered you millions to cover this up. Why didn't you take it?" "Because," Arturo said, picking up his canvas bag. "I promised a little girl I would help her build a Lego castle tonight. And I needed to make sure I could look her in the eye when I did." He turned and walked toward the door. "Arturo?" He paused. "The senior IT director position is currently vacant," Victoria said, stepping away from the table. "I'm going to need someone who isn't afraid to tell me no to rebuild our security infrastructure. The starting salary is $400,000 a year, plus stock options." Arturo looked back at the Billionaire CEO. The Ice Queen was gone, replaced by a leader he actually wanted to work for. "I'll need dental insurance," he said. "My daughter has surgery next month." Victoria smiled, crossing her arms. "Done. Go home to your daughter, Arturo. We have a lot of work to do on Monday." Arturo Pendelton risked his life, his freedom, and his future to take down a corrupt billionaire and a ruthless corporate board. He walked away, not just with his integrity intact, but with the power to rebuild Kensington Global alongside Victoria, on his own terms. Sometimes, the ghosts in the basement are the only ones who can save the people at the top of the tower. If this high-stakes tale of blackmail, hacking, and a father's relentless love kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share Arturo's incredible story with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling real-life dramas every week.